Last year I made a video about the history and whereabouts of the original puppets from the Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer Christmas special. It's still my favorite video I've made so far, go watch it after this one if you haven't seen it, partially because I stumbled upon a story I found so fascinating that I had to tell it, but also partially because I got to spend a whole month trying to figure out how to make this Rankin style stop-motion version of myself. And nothing brings me joy like disappearing into hyper-focus mode and sinking Baker's dozens of hours into arguably unnecessary stylistic flourishes and set dressing instead of making more videos and therefore more rent money. Or, while we're at it, contributing to society in some meaningful way. I made this in open source donut making / transcendent animal-based masterpiece making software, Blender. Before starting, I knew I wanted to imitate the Rankin style, but I had almost zero practical knowledge about 3D modeling, rigging, texturing, or animation. So what could go wrong? A lot. With enough foolishness, you can do it too. Plus, I spent all that time, what kind of YouTuber would I be if I didn't milk at least 2 videos out of it? This isn't going to be a fully comprehensive tutorial per se, more of a general overview. But if you're looking to do something similar and/or are familiar with Blender, I'd wager that this will give you a pretty good start. And I will show many of my settings, so feel free to pause and look if you want more detail. I'll also link some of the tutorials I used in the description. Otherwise, I hope it'll be kinda interesting to see how this was made, and I will not be offended if I get relegated to the second monitor for this one. Let's just chill for a bit, you know? So I started with this cutty little 3D model, which is just a collection of basic shapes that I very crudely moved and stretched into a basic Jawn shape based on these 2 reference images. I already had this because I used it as a reference for the intro to my first Dandadan video. I go into a little more detail on how I did that in this behind the scenes video I posted to Patreon, but it's far from being usable as an actual rigged character model. It's missing a ton of detail, not to mention the shell plates, all the parts are disconnected and would clip through each other weirdly, and most importantly, the topology is complete hogwash. So I had to start by refining, reshaping, and struggling through remeshing this model piece by piece until it was a relatively cohesive collection of meshes made of relatively small and uniform polygons that wouldn't stretch and twist weirdly in motion. I really wish I had screen recorded this entire process, but that video file would have been way too big to fit on the stack of floppy disks I back up my videos to, and if I did go into full detail on this process, we'd be here for weeks. But I did loosely follow this tutorial series from Daniel Kreuter, where he makes reg from Made in Abyss, which I recommend and I'll link in the description. Don't look too closely at this though, cause it is still pretty friggin' cockamamie if I do say so myself. I never said I was good at this or knew what I was doing, but it would be good enough for a character that's intentionally supposed to look like a stiff puppet with a limited range of motion. Once I had my mostly coherent collection of meshes, I was able to select everything that should be part of the shell, extrude those parts outward, and scale the whole shape up with a few adjustments to create this raised edge. I also added fangs, eyebrows, and these eyes that are just made of flattened spheres and textured to look like shiny little buttons. Now that I had a usable model, I rigged it with a basic human skeleton armature that I modified to have fewer vertebrae, fewer fingers, and a few extra bits like this bone that sticks forward to control the head, or this one that lets the bottom jaw flap up and down like a piece of wool with a wire in it, plus a couple to control the eyebrows and make the eyes blink. I still had to make it actually look like a puppet though, so it was time for texturing. The concept I decided on was that John's body would be primarily made of soft wool or felt like the reindeer and most other animals in Rankin movies, but it would be covered with a wooden shell that would be painted a shiny green color. But not too shiny, because in the actual productions, anything too reflective would show a visible reflection of the camera, so I made sure to add just enough roughness to make that impossible. The felt was what gave me the most trouble though. I started with a base of a highly distorted noise texture with color ramp and mix nodes that clamp the grayscale to these 2 different shades of brown. Ideally, almost none of this would be visible under the actual hair, but the bits that are should be a little darker than the final color because less light would penetrate that far. Fake ambient occlusion. For the actual hair though, I needed a particle system. Again, feel free to pause for more detail here, but this system basically creates about 8,000 tiny little hairs and twists them so that they curl in on themselves to create a cohesive shape. Each hair starts a little thicker and tapers towards the tip, which means I could take that thickness into shading with a curves info node and a color ramp to make it so that the hair starts dark and then gets lighter toward the tip to again mimic that ambient occlusion. I then mixed that with some general randomness to make it look more realistic. If I wanted it to be even more realistic for a single rendered image like this one or something, I would actually shrink the inner shapes, make way more hair particles, and make them longer, thinner, and more curly like Pixo 3D does in this tutorial, and I would have also used the higher quality rendering engine Cycles instead of Eevee. But I knew this video was going to be over 20 minutes long, and I needed to render it all out on my computer, which is in my bedroom, so I had to make it as easy to render as I possibly could. I didn't have the luxury of spending multiple minutes rendering each frame. Next came the movement, the actual animation itself. Along those same lines, I knew that if I tried to animate 20 minutes of talking and gesticulating, that alone would take weeks. After all, I'm no animation god like Tadahito Mochinaga, and the only experience I had in 3D animation was a summer course I took when I was 13, where the instructor told the whole class about how his friend farmed and sold World of Warcraft items as his job, where he made not very much, but some money, enough to live on as long as he didn't have to pay rent, and wasn't that so cool? And I remember pretending it was very cool while thinking, no, that actually sounds incredibly soul-crushing, Kenneth. And some Minecraft animations. Am I talking too much? How have you been lately? I wanted this to work as much like a VTuber model as possible, so I decided to try out motion capture. I was already attempting like 4 things I had never tried before, why not pile on one more? So, heavily inspired by this dude, Cameron Cortinas on TikTok, who does an incredible job of imitating various stop-motion styles in real life, I recorded my voiceover, made a rough cut, played that audio back through headphones, and recorded myself with my webcam, trying my best to act out the movements and gestures in sync with my own pre-recorded voice. This guy also obviously records in slow motion and speeds it up to enhance the effect, but this was already 20 minutes of miming to my own voice. I really didn't want to listen to my own voice slowed down for an hour straight, and possibly attempt that multiple times, even if it might have given slightly better results. I just did my best to move in a jerky, jittery way to give myself at least a baseline to start with, and then took that video and put it through Rococo Vision, a tool that uses machine learning to turn regular old video into motion capture data without any specialized equipment. One of a handful of applications of AI that I actually think is really cool. Though I should say it tries its best to convert video into motion capture data because, well, I went pretty hard on it. Ideally, they want you to use multiple camera angles and calibrate them with this printout so that it can understand your position in 3D space fully, but I didn't do any of that. I just recorded one angle and slapped it into Blender willy-nilly. The result was, as you might expect, a complete disaster. The raw motion capture was janky as hell, losing track of my arms at times, and it seemed to think I was doing this immaculate Michael Jackson lean the entire time. To make matters worse, not only was my crudely rigged model only vaguely human-shaped, I had also modeled it in an A pose, which is closer to Jawn's natural resting position than a T pose, which is what Rococo wanted. All this came together to make something that would be terrific for a horror short about a stuffed animal that gets possessed by a demon of non-Euclidean geometry. But I didn't need it to be perfect, I just needed it to be a baseline. With Blender's graph editor, you can see the rotation and position of each bone in each of 3 dimensions plotted out as a graph called an F-curve. And with some effects and modifiers, I could fix many of the problems I had with my motion capture. For example, this arm is just a touch too zany for my taste, so to rein it in, I used an envelope modifier to slide the entire graph up and down until I had a baseline that made more sense, scaled it down and smoothed it out a bit to reduce some of the unintentional erraticism from the struggling motion capture, and added constraints which stopped the bone from moving past a certain point. Once I was happy with the graph, I added a stepped interpolation modifier, which is simpler than it sounds. It just takes those smooth curves and turns them into discrete steps every few frames. This is what gives it that jerky stop motion look. I think most Rankin Bass stuff is animated on 2s, but after some experimentation, I did 3s for some of the smaller details, and I settled on a step every 4 frames for those broad motion capture movements, just because the underlying movements are too smooth and, most importantly, too constant. It needed some extra help to get that jittery feeling, and that's just what ended up looking the best to me. I used Southern Shoddy's Stop-Mo plugin for this, which I'll also link in the description, and which makes it a little quicker and more convenient, but all it's doing is applying that stepped interpolation modifier across the entire armature. Finally, once I was happy with the general shape of the graph, I could bake the F-curve, which turns it into individually editable keyframes, so I could go through and manually fix any random little glitches that were still there. For anyone who is following along, note that this step is destructive, so make sure you're completely done with the previous step and ideally make a backup first. I repeated this process for basically every part of the armature that moves, and locked the base rotation of the model in place completely as if its feet were nailed to the floor, and got something that's at least closer to what I was looking for. It still looks a little floaty, and by reining in all those glitchy bits, I also ended up compromising the expressiveness of the motion. It's all much smoother now, but everything looks quite stiff with a very limited range of motion. Luckily, that look actually works really well for this project, because it mimics the limitations that Tadahito Mochinaga and his animators faced with puppets posed with lead wire that was literally stiff and had a limited range of motion. But if I were to do this process again and go for a different style, I would definitely try to get better motion capture data and not have to manipulate it so much in post. Now I had a baseline for the general gestures and gesticulations that make the model feel alive and fill in the gaps, which would have taken ages to animate manually. But it's still miles away from looking anything like Rankin Bass. What I needed now was some actual animation done by hand, which there's really no substitute for. Luckily, the non-linear animation timeline lets you stash little pieces of animation individually and layer them over each other without affecting the other pieces underneath. With my horrible mocap setup and non-human model, I wasn't able to control the head or face at all, so I made some stock animations for blinking, head rotations, and eyebrow movements, as well as a handful of gestures, and duplicated them several times, combining them in different ways across the timeline, trying to match what I was talking about as best as I could. The mouth still isn't moving though, and this is my favorite part. With a feature called Bake Sound to F-Curves, which has since been renamed to Sound to Samples, you can take an audio clip and convert it directly into motion. So I took this jawbone, baked my audio file to its X rotation value, then like before used a slew of modifiers to make it so it mostly just flaps between an open and closed position, based on whether there's sound coming out of my real life noise flap. It's a little janky. Around the holidays, it's a tradition in my household to sit down and watch one of my favorite anime. But I looked closely at a bunch of scenes from Rudolph for reference, and well, it actually matches up pretty well.
Good grief!
They weren't doing a great job of lip syncing exactly.
It's like he said, I'll never fit in.
Finally, the cherry on the top that brings the whole thing together, I animated this walking animation fully by hand, trying to evoke that Rankin Bass type vibe by lifting the legs up as far as they would go without breaking my model for an exaggerated goose step with heavy inspiration from one foot in front of the other from Santa Claus is Coming to Town, but with some added side-to-side swaying to bring it more in line with Jawn's characteristic roly-poly waddle. Put that all together and you get this. With all the character animation finally finished, all that was left was some set dressing. This is all geometry nodes, basically. This snowy ground is just a plane with a subdivide modifier and a noise texture plugged into the offset, then shaded smooth. It's very simple, but here's a setup if you want to screenshot it for some reason. But the trees are where my indefatigable urge to sink hours and hours of my life into a relatively minor part of a project that could have easily been done much simpler with almost as good results came in. But check it out, I can just draw a line and a tree appears now. So that's cool. Initially, I took a screenshot from the Christmas special, removed Rudolph, and separated it into different layers so I could just place those layers in 3D space. But it didn't look quite convincing enough that this was actually a physical environment and not just a cheap compositing trick. I really wanted it to look like I had animated this with a little doll in a physical environment. So instead, I loosely followed this tutorial by Rankin. I also used his snow texture for the ground, by the way, adapting it along the way to fit my goal. It looks like these trees are made from a series of hand-cut cones of dark green felt with pieces of white felt glued on top for snow. I modeled one of the cones with a more basic version of the felt texture that I had used on Jawn that I'll show here, roughly cutting out the bottom edges to mimic the imperfections that come from having to cut probably hundreds of these delicate little pieces by hand, which really made me appreciate the effort that went into this stuff. I only had to make one of these. And again, I added a subtle noise texture to the offset, which makes it just a little wobbly, like felt handled by human hands. Now that I had that template, I could use it to procedurally generate as many trees as I wanted to. I won't go into full detail on every step because this got really complicated and I tried 1,000 different ways to do this, but again, here's the full setup if you want to take a closer look, and if you're trying to do something similar, I do really recommend this tutorial, which got me about 70% of the way there. Basically though, it takes a stroke that I draw, spawns 5 copies of that template cone along the curve, rotates them randomly around the axis, scales them from short and wide at the bottom to tall and thin at the top, and wiggles them around a bit for a little more imperfection. Unfortunately, the snow from the tutorial didn't work for me though, because I needed it to appear as random rounded patches rather than a uniform coating, and that's where things got really off the rails. All the rest of this node setup is just creating the snow. This noise texture and color ramp node create a wavy black and white texture. This section takes each instance of the cone model, subdivides it to get way more detail in the mesh, separates that mesh based on that black and white noise texture, making a copy of everything in the white sections. It then takes that copy, extrudes it slightly so it's sitting on top of the original, and changes it to a white version of the same felt texture. It then shades that smooth and merges it back in with the original mesh. You can ignore this part. It was a failed attempt to try a different way to smooth out the snow that didn't end up working. I could never fully get rid of these tiny jagged edges where the mesh had been separated, and surely there was a more optimal way to do this because all that extra geometry really took a toll on my poor computer. If there are any Blender geniuses in the comments, do let me know if there was a better way to do this. I'm sure there was. I did also think about procedurally generating the decorations on some of these trees, but at this point it was getting dangerously close to Christmas and I still needed to actually edit the whole video too, plus I had already scrapped another video to focus more on this one, so sheer panic was finally able to overcome the monkey in my brain that says, but it'd be so cool, how long could it possibly take? Because it could possibly take a very long time. I finally had my happy little trees and my computer's GPU was screaming for mercy. All that was left was the lighting and the finishing touches. The real Rudolph was shot in a studio set up in an old building in Tokyo that had previously been used to test aircraft engines during World War II, so to get closer to that studio look, I added 2 slightly warm white, halogen-ish softboxes in a 2-point lighting setup right in front of my subject and let that light fall off into the distance. I set the background color to try to match the special and let it emit some light through the scene, making the colors a little more cohesive, as if the background was reflecting some of the light. Then I noticed in my reference that there was a weird pinkish hue in the background of a lot of these shots, so I added one more huge but dim lavender softbox over the entire scene, which further tinted the background and also brightened up the snow a bit so it pops out from the sky better. And with a trendy mid-century TV model I downloaded off the internet and modified slightly, though I forgot to change the color of the screen to be a more realistic dark gray, one more chunk of snow that I animated with one more noise texture offset to act as a sort of splash effect as I dropped the TV into the snow from the sky, and some camera lens effects, I was finally able to render this all out over a couple dozen hours and start editing. So there you have it, an imitation Rankin Bass stop motion effect in Blender. Of course it could have been better and will always live in the shadow of Worthy Kid's incredible fake stop motion animation, but as a substitute for a VTuber model in a 20-minute video essay, I'm really happy with how it turned out. So was it worth it? Well, objectively, no. I absolutely should not have spent 2 months working on this one single video when I could get 7 times as many views on a video that I made in 4 days, but, well, sometimes you just gotta. That's what life's all about, for me at least. I hope this video helped a few people out there with their own projects, or failing that you at least found it interesting, or failing that you at least found it to be soothing background noise as you fall asleep. Thanks for watching, and thanks to my amazing supporters on Patreon who make it possible for me to make absolutely foolish decisions like this and not immediately end up lying in a ditch somewhere. Smackintosh, Scorpiante, Katie L, Retrohime, Cyrilile, Leia Pico, Nutaf, Patrick Davison, Arborix, June, Dr. Yola McSwag, Grav G, Squidgoo, Joe, Fug on Nugget, Annie, and Sammy Z, as well as all the other names you're seeing on the screen right now.